I like a good mystery in science when there's some facts that don't fit someone's theory and then they have to try to test new ideas out to see if they can modify their theory to better fit the facts. And I came across one of these as an undergraduate where I was happened to be taking some psychology and biology classes around the same time as each other. And the mystery was I was reading sources in psychology and learning about how humans and animals behave, and helping behavior among humans seems pretty common. But I wasn't seeing a ton of examples about helping behavior, selfless behavior in animals, and the few that I was reading about seemed like they were exceptions, not the rule. For example, very interesting, vampire bats actually, even though vampires in human mythology are pretty ruthless creatures, vampire bats have this really interesting behavior where, of course, they go out and they drink blood of animals like cows is a common victim of vampire bats. They consume a lot of blood, they go back to the colony, and the weird behavior that scientists are trying to figure out is that when they get back and are roosting, if a bat had a very successful night of trying to get blood and another one didn't, they would share with each other by regurgitating the blood and helping each other out. Really gross. It fascinated me, right? Because that's so gross. But the mystery here is that according to our view of how evolution works, this selfish gene approach, or this kin selection theory approach, terms you might have heard in this class or other places, then we should see a pattern where bats will primarily want to help themselves, because that's how evolution works. You help yourself first. That's probably what evolves. And if you do help somebody else, it will be organisms that you're highly related to, like family members. But the pattern we saw among these bats is that it didn't appear to be their family members they were helping. It was anybody who needed help. And so there were studies about this, and the more I read about this, there are whole models that shift how we view things in biology and evolution, trying to explain how and when helping behavior or other concern is more beneficial from an evolutionary perspective than self-concern. And it turns out there are a lot of cases. It's actually not really the exception to a rule, it's just that the rule is most organisms are designed by evolution for selfish behavior. But just because the majority of your behaviors are selfish doesn't mean all of them are. A lot of organisms, maybe even most, will also help out others, even at their own expense, and this is probably evolutionarily adaptive to do that. So anyway, I'm fascinated by this. Let's talk about these behaviors. We're going to focus on humans, but I'll mention some other examples in animals. All right, I talked about animals and evolution. Let's refocus back on humans with a problem that you might see in a philosophy class, and I've seen it all the time online, the trolley problem. I want you to imagine for a minute that you are witness to a runaway trolley is barreling down the tracks, and for reasons we're not going to get into, this is a thought experiment. If you choose to do nothing, that runaway trolley is going to hit 5 people that are stuck for some reason on the tracks. You're going to witness 5 people being hurt and killed. However, you notice, as part of this thought experiment, that you can flip a lever, and that lever will divert the trolley to a different track, but there is one person stuck on that track. Now the question, this trolley problem, is which is the morally correct thing to do? You should do nothing and the trolley will hit 5 people. Or you can flip the lever and you are now responsible for that trolley hitting 1 person. So what do you think is the right thing to do here? Now, according to philosophy, there are actually several systems of morality that have been developed by different philosophers, and these systems would disagree about what the right thing to do is in a lot of cases. There is the utilitarian viewpoint, which says you should do the most good for the most people. So maybe according to the utilitarian viewpoint, well, one person getting injured is less harm than 5 people getting injured, so you should flip the lever. But there are other rule-based viewpoints, deontological viewpoints, which says that moral actions are you contributing to outcomes. So if you do nothing, you did not murder 5 people. However, if you flip that lever, you cause the trolley to hit someone. You contributed to the death of someone, and according to some rule-based systems, that is the worst outcome. Even though less people got injured, you've done more moral wrong in that instance. Which judgment did you think was correct? Well, this was a philosophy problem for a long time. And then recently, Josh Green kind of kickstarted this, and then other psychologists have followed up on this, asked people to give their answer to the trolley problem while also investigating their psychological state, such as brain activity during an fMRI. So some people think the solution to the trolley problem is you should flip the lever. Other people think you should not flip the lever. Turns out that different brain areas might be active when you're making either of those decisions. For people that are very distressed at the thought of actually having to do something, pull the lever, and somebody gets hurt, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is more active. And in other studies, it appears that this track in the brain is related to emotion-based processing. For people that believe that you should save the most number of people, even if it makes you uncomfortable to act and pull the lever, their ventromedial prefrontal cortex is active. This is another pathway in the brain under the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex that appears in other studies to be linked with more calculated reasoning or utilitarian reasoning. So it's possible, I can't tell you as a scientist which is the correct answer, but I can tell you as a psychologist, it appears that which answer you believe is correct is associated with a different type of processing in your brain. So we've mentioned that helping behavior could be an evolved tendency. It's an evolved behavior. We've mentioned that helping behavior might originate somewhere in your brain, choosing to intervene in a situation. Let's go over some other, basics of the vocab I'm going to be using and where we think helping behavior came from before we move on. I want to mention that you've probably heard the word altruism. And the way altruism is used in everyday speech is that altruism is helping someone. But psychologists, biologists, and philosophers make a more careful distinction between helping behavior and altruism. So I use helping behavior because that is any behavior where you're assisting someone else. That's it. Altruism is a specific category of behavior. Altruism is you're helping someone else in a way that does not benefit you. The further complicated by there's a debate in different fields about whether we should consider any act altruistic or whether there's a distinction between altruism and pure altruism. So pure altruism is the term used by some people to refer to an action that clearly has no benefit to yourself or even hurt yourself. Now, what is the debate here? The debate is that from a psychological standpoint, helping someone else, even if it doesn't give you material benefits to help someone else, it does give you psychological benefits. So should we consider that altruism? If I see somebody on the street, they're struggling and they're asking for money, and I give them $5, I have lost material wealth and got no benefit from that. So maybe that should be considered altruism. But if I give them some money, I feel good about it. So is that really altruism if I felt good about it? So from that perspective, it's very hard to find actions that are truly altruistic because it's rare that somebody would perform an action, even helping someone else, that they feel bad about. I'm not going to give money to the person asking for it if I think that's the wrong decision. So does true altruism even exist? This is more complicated when you look at the evolutionary level of analysis, because according to some biological perspectives, altruism as a behavior would only exist if it was adaptive in our previous environment, which means that we get benefits from it. So we would not evolve a behavior that we don't get any benefits from. That's not how evolution works. So maybe altruism doesn't exist at all. If you want to read more about this, there's a very short book on the subject called Does Altruism Exist? Written by an evolutionary biologist that I recommend. But for this presentation, for this class, I'm going to use those broad definitions: helping behavior, choosing to help someone else. Altruism is choosing to help someone else when there's very little benefit or even harm to yourself. So as I open the presentation with, there's different levels of analysis of why organisms or why humans help each other. The bat example looks at it from an evolutionary lens. The trolley problem example looks at it from a brain lens. Let's quickly go over 3 different levels of analysis, and they are the individual, the interpersonal, and the cultural. So each of these are independent of each other. They could all be true explanations, but they're true separately at different levels of looking at where the behavior originates from. I'm also going to go back over the evolutionary perspective with the proper vocab added in, since I quickly went through it with that vampire bat example. All right, at an individual level, we have to look at the basic process of learning or conditioning that we've looked at in a lot of other chapters. Perhaps we help each other because of the operant conditioning principles. If you help someone else and then get rewarded for it, you're more likely to help someone else again in the future. So this kind of becomes circular, because if you have kids and you see them helping other kids or being nice to other people, and you reward them for it, they will learn that helping behavior is good, and they will then perform helping behavior, and they will teach their kids to help other people. We have to go back to the evolutionary explanation to know, like, that this is a chicken and egg problem. Where did this originate in the first place? There's tons of evidence that our decision to help other people does have this individual level explanation. If you get more rewarded for helping others, you will help others more in the future. This is influenced at the cultural level by the norms of the culture you're in. If it's normal to help in certain situations, you're more likely to help because that's something your culture approves of, so you get a bigger reward for doing it. This does seem kind of cynical to many people. Does this mean that we only help when we get some benefit from it? We're going to look at other levels of analysis and see that I don't think that's true. Humans don't just help each other when they know there's an immediate benefit, although the situation does have a huge impact on your personal decision to help or not. One of the classic studies in psychology that shows this is when Darley and Batson in the 70s set up a situation among a group they expected to be pretty helpful, and that's seminary students. So they performed an experiment on a campus with seminary students where they had them sign up for participation in a psychology study, and in a very clever and common manipulation, they did part 1 of the study and then were told to go to another building on campus to do part 2 of the study. And the researchers manipulated a situation they would encounter on the way. The researchers added a second variable where they were manipulating what the seminary students were thinking of. All right, so what was their first consideration? Well, they thought, let's do something ordinary. Our first independent variable is whether the students are in a hurry or not. So they told the seminary students, you need to hurry to the next part of the study. Please go there immediately. So to rush them, right? In a control condition, they said, you've got plenty of time, make your way over there. You know, you can take a nice walk through campus, that's fine. Now, the second manipulation was that the participants going from one building to the other encountered a situation where somebody needed help. Okay, so the expectation was that if they're in a hurry, they might be less likely to help. So, and in fact, we do find this in small amounts that if people are rushed, they're in a hurry, they might be less likely to stop for help, but it's not a big effect. I don't think it was statistically significant in this study. Now, the second manipulation was much more interesting because when they went from one building to another, they encountered a person asking for help on the side of the road, looking very pitiful. And it was meant to be similar to the story of the Good Samaritan that comes from the Bible. There's a reason for this, because as part of the study, the students were also manipulated in another way. When they got to the first location, they were either practicing a speech that was a control group that had nothing to do with the story of the Good Samaritan, or they were practicing a small talk on the topic of the Good Samaritan and how important it is to stop and help people. So the thinking goes, this is a cognitive psych thing. If we prime people to be thinking about helping, they should be more likely to stop and help. So if you remove the effect of whether they were in a hurry or not, this was true a little bit. Those that were practicing a speech about helping the Good Samaritan were a little bit more likely to stop and help than those that were practicing a control speech. Where things get interesting is when you combine these two variables, because individuals that were practicing a speech about the Good Samaritan that were in a hurry, they were told, please get to the next building as soon as possible, they didn't stop and help. Just because they were in a hurry, even if they were practicing a speech about the topic of the Good Samaritan. This shows that, yes, your individual choices and your individual preferences are important, but the situations you find yourself in, the power of the situation is also extremely powerful. Even if you're a seminary student who's practicing a speech about helping the Good Samaritan, you won't stop and help the Good Samaritan if you're in a hurry. So at the individual level, we would stop and help other people when we choose to. Maybe we get some reward from that. We feel good about it. But what about at the interpersonal level? Well, here I want to introduce the idea of reciprocal altruism. So remember, altruism is helping somebody else with very little expectation that they can help you in the future. Reciprocal altruism is the idea that if we help other people now, they might return the favor should we need their help in the future. So reciprocal altruism, I'll give the example of growing up in a pretty large family. I might help my family members out, knowing they can't help me in return, but expecting that on average, if I help them out now, they're likely to help me out again in the future. This gives us some insight into both human behavior, but also back to those vampire bats I mentioned earlier. Perhaps their sharing behavior is a form of reciprocal altruism. And this is what studies show, that bats that have a very successful night of feeding, they will share with others to help them out when they weren't as successful. But over time, what we see on average is that they will get helped in return by their neighbors and their colony mates. So reciprocal altruism works in many species. I'm going to help you now, you might help me again in the future. Importantly, this kind of builds up more value than the investment that we put in. So if I trade you $5 of goods and I get $5 of goods in return, we might view that as a zero-sum situation. I mean, if I pay you $5 and you give me a product worth $5, that totals to zero. But that's really not taking the psychological impact into consideration, because if I give you $5 and you give me $5 worth of product, we've also established a social relationship. So there's some value there above and beyond the monetary value. With the example of the vampire bats, if I share 5 milliliters of blood tonight and you share 5 milliliters of blood another night, we might think that totals to zero exchanged. But blood, like other resources, is worth more when people are really in need of it. So the value that you're contributing to the group goes up. This is probably why humans can sustain such large cooperative societies. Because when we help each other, we end up creating value with the group. So there's a couple different terms, like reciprocal altruism applies at the individual level. So I help my brother, I expect he might help me in the future. But there's also social exchange theories of human behavior that try to explain our helping behavior in large-scale societies. I go through and travel for a conference, I eat at a restaurant, and I tip very well. I don't need to, but I tip above what is normal for the culture I'm in. Now, according to reciprocal altruism, I'm only going to do that if I expect I might get something in return in the future. But if I'm traveling to a conference in another city, there's very little expectation that if I am really nice to a server, they can repay that kindness in the future. But according to social exchange theories, we don't necessarily need to be cooperative and be kind to people at an individual level that might help us again in the future. This is because if it's the norm for a society that you live in or a group that you live in that you should help out other people, then on average, I'm helping other people who might be strangers. They are helping people who are strangers. They are helping people who are strangers. And this creates a chain. This creates a network where I'm likely to get a return on my investment in the future, even if it's not necessarily from the exact same source as the person I originally helped. I live in a part of the country now where it's completely normal to stop and help people if you see them in distress on the side of the road during winter when it's cold and dangerously cold outside. It's very unlikely that if I stop and help someone, they will stop and help me again in the future. But if it's the norm that our culture has established that you should stop and help people, then I live in a place where I expect myself to help, and I expect that I will probably get help from strangers. So it builds up that social capital in the network. I want you to ask yourself, like, to what extent do you think that the culture you live in has reciprocity norms? So reciprocity norms would be expectations about your behavior of giving favors back to other people, right? If somebody stops and helps you, you're expected to help somebody else in the future. Social responsibility norms are also found in every single culture where there is some expectation that it's normal and expected in most human cultures that you will help out other people even if there's no direct benefit to yourself. It's very rare in human cultures to find total selfishness. It's abnormal in the span of human existence. So try to think for a minute. Remember, there's a difference between descriptive norms and injunctive norms. Descriptive norms are your expectations about what people are doing. Injunctive norms are your ideas about what people should be doing in your culture to help out others. I understand, even if I don't have kids, that I am paying taxes and that is contributing to schools in my area. That's an injunctive norm in this culture, right? You should pay all your taxes so that it can go to funding things like schools, even if you personally don't have kids. There's the expectation that contributing to that social system will end up benefiting you indirectly, even if it doesn't benefit you directly. And descriptive norms are norms about what people are doing to help each other out. I, inside my own head, have the descriptive norm in the place I live now about when you see someone stranded on the side of the road during winter, it is a normal thing to do to stop and offer them help and supplies. That's a descriptive norm because I believe that's what most people do. So I feel pressure to do it as well. So we know where helping behavior might come from, like psychologically and at that interpersonal level, but why are organisms designed to help each other in the first place? Isn't evolution about being selfish and helping yourself? Isn't that the way to get ahead in evolutionary terms? Well, there's actually different explanations from evolutionary biology, and even though they disagree on the particulars, both theories I'm going to present still predict that in some cases organisms will not be selfish. They will help each other out. So let's look at that kin selection theory and multi-level selection theory. Kin selection theory is an expansion on our understanding of genes. So once biologists understood that evolution was happening, they needed to help explain how is evolution happening. When genes were discovered, and we now know that organisms have genes that pass on heritable information from one generation to the next, then suddenly evolutionary biology has this revolution where we understand that evolution is happening based on genes. And it makes sense that over time in a species, genes that are better about helping an organism survive and helping an organism reproduce will become more common. And over time, that'll lead to changes in that organism. But it's not just genes that help an organism survive selfishly that might survive into the next generation. Because if I have genes that help program me to have a fear response to bears, because bears live in the mountains where I come from. So if I am afraid of bears and I avoid one when I see it, I am more likely to survive than someone who is not afraid of bears. That makes sense, right? Genetic change can happen that way. But according to the kin selection approach, I may also have genes that program me for the psychological tendency to help out my family members. So if I see a bear, I'm afraid of it, but my brother, when we were kids, he doesn't see it. He's not afraid of it. I'm going to grab him and run too, because he carries approximately 50% of the same genes that I do. Kin selection theory says that you can help your own genes survive and thrive when they're in your body or when they're in the body of other organisms, such as the gene copies that I have that are also present in my family members. That's kin selection theory. A funny example of this comes from J.B.S. Haldane, one of the original evolutionary theorists, who said, apocryphally, I am prepared to lay down my own life to save 2 brothers or 8 cousins. He probably, if you do the math, 2 brothers might contain about 100% of my genes. 8 cousins are likely to contain 100% of my genes. He probably didn't actually say that, but it is actually based on some of his writings. And it reflects the fact that we can help preserve our own genes, whether they're in our body or the bodies of others. There's examples of this in the animal kingdom that are much more dramatic than in humans. Ant colonies, for example, will engage in extremely complex self-sacrificing behavior for the good of the colony. So an individual ant might sacrifice its own life if it helps out the colony, which will then preserve its own genes. This actually leads us into the next idea, which is that kin selection theory states that cooperative behavior or other concerned behavior, non-selfish behavior, will evolve under certain circumstances, but it's still pretty rare according to most kin selection theory models. This is why I want you to be aware that there's an alternative called multi-level selection theory. Multi-level selection theory says that kin selection still happens, but evolution occurs simultaneously at multiple levels. So there is a constant competition between genetic forces at the cellular level, at the organism level, at the group level, and these evolutionary forces are constantly competing with each other for dominance. And under special circumstances, cooperation at a higher level can be achieved. Probably the best example of this is that if we look at the history of life on Earth, we see that single-celled prokaryotic organisms were the first cells to develop, and it took millions of years for prokaryotic cells, which are very simple, to evolve into eukaryotic cells, where there are different components inside the same cell that all work together. You know how the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and you've got all kinds of mitochondria inside you? The mitochondrial DNA, that's a different organism. It originally was a different cell than your human DNA. You've got that invader in all of your cells today, but it's so super cooperative that it's just a normal part of eukaryotic cells. So individual cells banded together and started working together at some point in history. And then eukaryotic cells banded together and started working together and formed multicellular organisms, which eventually evolved into the plants, animals, and fungi that we see today. These were leaps in evolution, this cooperation instead of competition. And it's happened again because there are certain species of animals on the planet that are cooperative to a point that they act functionally as a unit, not as an individual, but as a group. An ant colony or a bee colony are great examples of this. An ant colony is best understood as a functional organization of many units that all act together. Most individual ants don't compete for their own genetic continuation. The colony competes for its own genetic continuation. So this super cooperation at different levels occurs in rare instances. The controversy with this is whether group selection, which is when groups of an animal compete with other groups of an animal, occurs very often. According to kin selection theory, this is possible, but it's extremely, extremely rare. People that favor multi-level selection theory think that group level forces are more common. They're still rare, but they are more common and we should take them into consideration. The biologist E.O. Wilson, and among other biologists, believes that we should consider group level evolutionary selection when it comes to humans, for example. That evolutionary forces between groups of humans were a major factor in our evolution. Now, why is this important? To my mind, this is important because multi-level selection theory helps explain why humans are so cooperative compared to other similar species. So regardless of how we got here, humans are very cooperative as a species. Let's get out of the explanations of where cooperation comes from and get back into explanations of how it works at an interpersonal level. So remember from early in class, we've talked all through the semester about how affect, behavior, and cognition all work together. So affect being things like your mood state. Could your mood impact whether you're likely to help other people or not? Well, a consistent finding is that when we're in a better mood, we're more likely to do pro-social things, help out other people, such as you're more likely to donate blood if you're in a better mood. You're more likely to help coworkers in your workplace if you're in a better mood. Some other specific emotions that change your helping response include empathy and guilt. Guilt, for example, when you feel guilty about something, you're more likely to help out. This is probably an adaptive thing. Guilt is a human emotion that is meant to encourage us to help out so we can reduce our feelings of guilt and get back in with the group. Now, empathy refers to an affective response in which a person understands or feels another person's distress and experiences events the way the other person does. I just want to be clear that psychologists do distinguish between feeling personal distress, feeling empathy, and feeling sympathy. Let's imagine I go to class after a test and I made a really good grade, but my best friend in the class got a really bad grade. Personal distress is I feel bad just because I'm witnessing somebody else that's hurt. I feel uncomfortable when I witness other people that are hurt, okay? Empathy is when I can feel what he is feeling if he got a bad grade, right? I can put my mind in the space of understanding and feeling what he must be going through getting a bad grade on the exam. So personal distress, I don't have to know how he feels. I just know he's hurting, so that makes me feel distressed. Empathy is I'm imagining what he must be feeling. Sympathy is I feel bad for you because you're hurting. So I can feel sympathy. I feel bad that you got a bad grade on the test. Even if I don't feel personal distress, like it doesn't bother me you got a bad grade, but that sucks for you, dude. And I can feel sympathy, but not empathy, or vice versa. I can understand how you must feel getting a bad grade on the exam, but that doesn't make me pity you. Or if I felt sympathy, I feel bad that you got a bad grade on the test, but I can't imagine what that feels like, right? So personal distress, empathy, and sympathy, they are often related, but just to be clear, they're not the same thing. So anyway, with those definitions out of the way, how can empathy change whether you're likely to help someone else or not? Well, Batson and Ahmad did a series of experiments on empathy and how that changes our decision making. So affect and cognition, decision making is cognition, behavior, how you treat other people, right? It's all connected. So in one study, Batson and Ahmad put 60 people in a prisoner's dilemma type situation in which they knew the other person had already defected. Logically, in a vacuum, this should mean the participant would defect too, but the authors manipulated an independent variable. Some people received an empathy induction and others didn't. They found that when the participants went through the empathy induction, their defection rate went down from 95% to 45%, almost in half. So just by changing how much empathy that you felt for someone else, they changed how cooperative that person would be. Empathy promoted cooperative behavior. Let me give you another thought experiment from philosophy that one of my professors taught me. I want you to imagine you walk by a puddle on the street and you see a child. They've fallen in the puddle. They're drowning in it. You could stop and help save the child, but you're wearing a very expensive suit. If you jump into the puddle to help save the child, you are going to ruin your suit, lose a bunch of money. It was a tailored suit, but you can save the child. Would you help? Now, most people say yes, they would help. But I want, in a psychology course, for you to take a next step further and try to ask yourself, why did you help? Okay? We can go back to some of the explanations from earlier. Maybe it is a social norm where you're from that you should help people in distress. But what about at an individual level? Would you think you would help and save the child even if you didn't think it was normal in society for you to help out? This leads me to a discussion of personal distress. So it's different than empathy. Personal distress is the distress, the bad feelings that I have when I witness someone else being hurt or harmed. I feel intense personal distress just even telling you about this example, to be honest, thinking about a child that's drowning in a puddle. So I would sacrifice my own resources to jump in and help. I would ruin the suit and save the child. Not because I'm altruistic, maybe I would, but I benefit from helping in this situation because personal distress, I want to get rid of that, and the way to get rid of that is to help the child out. What psychologists have found is that personal distress at witnessing something bad happening is a huge motivator in our decision to help or not. When we recognize that something is happening we can help with, if you feel distress at that, it motivates you to jump in and help. Now, maybe you also feel empathy, maybe you also feel sympathy, but those are not necessary to promote you to help. The fact that personal distress and empathy both promote people to help in situations where, someone is in need, isn't just something we've explored at the behavioral level. We've also explored this at the level of the brain. In one study, for example, researchers were asking people to read passages from biographies, and the passages were selected because they contained a lot of human suffering. So in one of their studies, participants were in an fMRI, a functional magnetic resonance imaging machine, while they were reading these passages. So they looked at parts of your brain that were active while reading these distressing passages. They asked people afterwards to self-report their emotions, and afterwards they gave them a chance to donate to charity. So what the researchers were interested in part of the study, was can we look at what brain areas were active and then their decision to donate to charity, and see if there's any patterns of brain activity that are related to the donation. And in fact, that is what they found. There were certain neural states and self-report that were linked with the decision to give to charity. One of the areas associated with greater distress and greater giving to charity was the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex is involved in a lot of things we've discussed in a social psych class, including our ability to try to understand what other people are feeling. So the researchers concluded here, it appears to be that if you're reading passages about people suffering, you might be using your prefrontal cortex to put yourself in their shoes and feel empathy. And if you're doing that, you're more likely to want to donate to charity afterwards to kind of reduce your feelings of personal distress. Because when you help other people out, it makes you feel better after, going through this stressful event of reading about people suffering. All right, you might recognize these names because I've unintentionally cited these researchers throughout a lot of this presentation because their research has been so influential. Let's look at their model of helping behavior and focus on some of the environmental variables in our decision to help or not to help. Now, Latton and Darley's model of helping is one thing social psychologists might use to try to explain how even if different people are similarly motivated to help out others, the situation that we're in can help facilitate us helping other people or slow us down in our decision to help other people. If an emergency is occurring, for an example, well, at a basic level, if you don't notice the event happening, you can't decide to help. But a cognitive appraisal process happens. So first is perception, you see the event. Next is cognitive appraisal. Do you interpret the event as an emergency? And that's where individual factors have to come in. Are you willing to assume responsibility for the situation? And a large stumbling block is, do you know what should be done in a specific situation? Do you know the appropriate form of assistance? So we like to think that we would jump in and help during an emergency, but analyzing these steps helps show us that there are actually several cognitive steps that you have to go through to decide to intervene in a particular scenario. Why is this information helpful? I think the best use of this knowledge is understanding that if we can manipulate situations to get people through these steps more effectively, it'll lead to more helping behavior. For example, what is one reason that CPR classes are required in many professions? Because if you know the appropriate form of assistance for certain common emergencies, then you're more likely to go to the intervention stage. Now, another thing that this model can help us understand is that people have to assume responsibility for a situation before they can get to administering assistance. But there are a lot of social pressures pushing us not to jump in and intervene in situations. We can manipulate this to our advantage, though, and get people to help out. An easy way of doing this is manipulating the extent to which someone views an emergency as their problem. When you're in an emergency and you're in a crowd and you see people watching, they're rubbernecking, no one's jumping in to help. One way you can trick people psychologically and get them out of that frozen state where they're just watching an emergency happen is point to a specific person. You in the blue shirt, you need to call 911. You in the red shirt, you need to go help over here. By manipulating people's environment, somebody just pointed at me and asked me to help out. You've manipulated the social situation and pushed them on to the next step, meaning that they're more likely to actually help. They get out of that frozen state that the situation might put them in. All right, we've looked at different levels of analysis. Let's look and see, can we tell if someone is more likely to help based on their personality or maybe their gender or their culture? We're also going to talk in this section about how you may be more or less likely to help based on how you perceive a situation. Let's get right into it. So first, is there an individual difference in helping from person to person? So is there a person variable that predicts likelihood to help that isn't just part of your culture? It does appear that there is a difference from person to person in how likely they are to jump in and help in a particular situation. Some people just are helpful individuals. This is part of maybe there's a hereditary component. You come from a family of people that help. There's also a learned component. Did your family teach you as you're growing up that you should help out? If you have a personality that predisposes you to want to help other people, doesn't matter what the cultural norm is, you're going to jump in and help. There's some conflicting evidence about whether men or women in different cultures are more likely to provide help in situations. It does appear that in a lot of cultures, men are more likely to help out in situations that require physical strength. Women are more likely to help out by providing comfort, by providing resources. On average, across all situations, helping behavior between men and women is very similar, although studies, like I mentioned, have found some specific instances in which men are more likely to help or women are more likely to help. Going back to attribution theory, which we've talked about a couple times, this is another important determination of how likely we are to give our assistance. So remember, attribution theory is the study of what attribution we make about someone's behavior. Attributions are how we explain why someone engaged in certain behaviors. For example, if you see someone that is in distress, they're in a bad situation and they're asking for help, you could make an internal attribution for their situation. So, I think that you need help because of something you did to yourself. Or you could make an external attribution about their situation. I think you need help because you were placed in a situation that puts you at a disadvantage where you need help. And it turns out, if you have an external attribution for how someone got into their situation, you're more likely to help. Someone is homeless, and this unhoused person, you view that they became unhoused because of their own internal reasons, you are less likely to offer assistance. But if you meet an unhoused person and you view their situation as caused by circumstances outside of their control, you're more likely to offer assistance. In the 2010s, there's a ton of different studies showing the same pattern. I just picked a couple to cite for this presentation. For example, if someone is suffering from depression and you view depression as more controllable, you have less sympathy towards someone suffering from depression, so you may be less likely to help that person out. There was another study I mentioned in an advanced course where pregnant mothers mothers who had just given birth, who were experiencing postpartum depression, individuals were asked about their likelihood to offer assistance, time, and resources to mothers suffering from postpartum depression. And if you view postpartum depression as outside of the mother's control, you're more likely to help out. But if postpartum depression is viewed as something that the mother can control, you're less likely to offer your assistance. So think about, I want you, I'm not asking you to change your behaviors because I'm not making moral judgments here. I'm telling you the science behind this. But I do want you to examine your behaviors. The next time that you come across a situation in which someone is asking for help, whether you decide to help them or not, I want you to examine your choice. Are you helping because what do you think got them into the situation where they're asking for help? What attributions are you making, and how is that informing your choice? Now, I want to bring up another cultural difference in helping behavior. I'm going to give you like the oversimplistic view and then the more like realistic, more complex view. The really oversimplified view you see in a lot of textbooks is that individualistic cultures tend to focus on exchange, fair exchange, and reciprocity. So if I am in a very individualistic culture, I'm only going to help out when I can know for sure I'll be helped in return, right? Collectivistic cultures tend to focus on helping if someone is part of a group that I'm a member of, whether I expect to get something in return or not. So collectivistic cultures will help group members, right? You're from the same country I am, I'll help you. You're from the same religion I am, I will help you out, right? Whether I expect you'll be able to return that help or not. There's really an oversimplistic view, right? Like many times in this class, we've looked at, different levels of analysis show us a more clear picture. Whether you're in an individualistic or collectivistic culture, the specific kind of intersection of group membership and distress people are in is a clearer picture of whether you help or not, right? If someone is a part of a group that you feel a strong identity toward, you're more likely to help them out. It's just that collectivistic cultures in general tend to have stronger group identities at a larger level, like the national level, right? You can use this to your advantage, whether you're in an individualistic country or a collectivistic country, by trying to find connections between someone that you're asking for help, right? You're from North Dakota, you see someone on the road stops and is asking if you need assistance. If you're both from North Dakota, if you're both from this part of the country, establish that as a connection point. They're more likely to help out. So it's about group identity. Another place we see this is that there's a difference in how different societies engage in selfish behavior versus other helped or other concerned behavior in what are called economic games. So I've given you a couple of examples of these economic games that researchers use, but I haven't defined them in this presentation. An economic game is when researchers set up a scenario where different players or different participants in a psychology study or economics study are given different options to choose from, and they play this game to earn points, or in some cases earn actual money. But the decisions they're making are whether they cooperate with someone else or don't cooperate with someone else. An example of this is the dictator game, which is an economic game where, as part of a psychology study, I'm going to give you $3 and you get to choose how much of the $3 that you keep and how much you transfer to your partner. And then they get to choose whether that's a fair deal or not. And if both of you agree on a fair deal, you both get to keep the money. But if the dictator gives an amount of money that is not viewed as fair, both of you get nothing, right? That's an example of an economic game that we use in psych experiments. So in most of these economic games, they're set up intentionally so that there are more selfish options or more cooperative options. So one thing psychologists can do is compare different parts of a country or different parts of the world and see if different cultures are more or less likely to engage in the selfish option or the cooperative option. Now, for a long time, these studies, when you look at the publications on this for decades, were done in exclusively weird cultures. Weird, of course, I'm using the definition from psychology, which these cultures are Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. These cultures all share, right, core cultural components. And so when studies were done comparing weird cultures to weird cultures, we see a good mix of selfish and cooperative behavior. But researchers in 2005 compared behavior in 19 small-scale societies, none of which were weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic cultures. These small-scale civilizations, in many cases, had only been contacted more recently. Many of them lived according to their traditional lifestyles, their ancestral lifestyles. They try not to participate in global capitalistic monoculture. So when we compare weird cultures to these non-weird cultures, we see that these small-scale societies living as much as they can according to their ancestral ways blow the weird cultures out of the water when it comes to cooperation. Their level of selfishness in these economic games is extremely low. Almost no selfish behavior, right? In the dictator game, right? Hey, I'm going to give you $3. How much do you think is fair to donate to your partner? American college students in this situation, if I give you $3, the most common thing they do is they say, I'll donate $1.50 to my partner. And they consider that fair. But in many of the civilizations from this study in 2005, I'm going to give you the equivalent of $3, and the participant says, okay, I'm going to give $3 to this other person. And they both think that's fair. Okay, that is a behavior that is not seen in these weird samples. The researchers, this is a very, very interesting study showing that it's not a human universal to be selfish in these games. They also try to offer their explanation for what is the reason that these civilizations are all so different in terms of selfishness or cooperation. And one pattern we see, not necessarily in the citation on the screen, but in follow-up studies where people have written about this, is market integration. So to what extent does a culture engage in economic transactions or global capitalism, right? Or they engage in buying and selling as their main source of commerce and trade? Because the modern economic system that we're using, like in the US today, has only been around for hundreds of years, right? Not thousands of years. For civilizations that engage in this global trade system, our selfish behavior on these economic games tends to be very high. For cultures that have only recently started to incorporate elements of this capitalistic system, their selfish behavior is extremely low. Why do we find this pattern? There's different theories about that, and we can look into this more if anybody wants to talk about it. But that is one of the potential explanations for these differences. I want to make sure to end a presentation on helping behavior with a positive note, right? How do we increase helping behavior? I think by recognizing some of the discouraging facts from this presentation, we can just look at their opposite. If we know some of the things preventing people from helping out others, then we can try to manipulate the situation to, prevent those things from happening and get them to help others. Helping out other people is a mix of personal decisions, right? I want to help others, and environmental variables. It's easy to offer help to others. For most people, it does feel good to help others. So if you make it easy to help out other people, they will choose that option. Some locations have chose to enact Good Samaritan laws, so it becomes an injunctive norm. It's in the law books that you have to help other people. In some locations, if you witness someone else that is in distress, you can offer them help and you choose not to. that can become a legal issue. It could be illegal not to offer your help to someone suffering from distress. I think the biggest piece of advice I have for encouraging people to help out is to think about psychologically how to encourage people to feel connected to the situation. Engage personal distress. Make people feel like the situation is preventable, it's something they should care about, and it's personal. Now, there's a quote on this slide that actually presents real findings psychologists have found. So, a single death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. So, it turns out that our human social brains do have this weakness where when we experience tragedy in large numbers or in statistics, it doesn't impact our brain as much as when we experience personal stories of tragedies. So if I see an advertisement on TV that is telling me about, the percentage of people who are unhoused, the amount of money spent on these programs, and other abstract statistics, I'm less likely to connect to that than if I see an advertisement telling me the personal stories of unhoused individuals. When we feel that personal connection, it engages different areas of the brain, helps us connect, and motivates us to help. So if you want people to help out, if you want people to engage in pro-social behavior, help them connect on a personal level, not help them connect with statistics. All right, that's where we'll end for this presentation. Some of these citations are presented in a little bit more detail in the textbook, others are not. If you are interested in the biological underpinnings of altruism, I do suggest work by David Sloan Wilson. He wrote the book, Does Altruism Exist? There's also a very interesting recent book by E.O. Wilson about his idea that humans are an intensely cooperative species, that multi-level selection theory probably helps explain human adaptations in terms of cooperation. Funny enough, D.S. Wilson and E.O. Wilson, no relation whatsoever, even though they're both evolutionary biologists. If you want to look more into the psychology of our moral decision making, Josh Green, who I mentioned in this presentation, is doing fMRI research on participants while they're making moral decisions, has written a book on the subject, maybe 2 books at this point, where he takes some of the research he's been involved with and other modern research on brain and behavior and translates it into a really easily readable approach rather than the technical language that you'd find in my citations here on the slide. But thanks everyone.